Two young women sat on their beds, staring as if through the walls. They couldn't talk to each other because of the language barrier. One was a 21-year-old Chinese woman, the other a 19-year-old from the USSR. But when a Japanese man named Naokata Ishibashi showed up, they both started sweet-talking him. The day before, he'd given them a mirror, actually just a tiny piece of glass. But it was the first time in months they'd seen their own faces. The tired eyes, the pale skin, the way their cheeks had sunk in. Since both of them were prisoners, trapped behind the walls of the top-secret Project Unit 731, and Ishibashi was their overseer. In this video, I'm going to tell you about one of the darkest chapters in modern human history. Viewer discretion is advised. In July 1940, a deadly typhoid epidemic broke out in Japanese-occupied Shanghai. A few months later, two more cities, Ningbo and Suzhou, were struck by the plague. The disease spread fast, infecting thousands of Chinese villagers. But here's the terrifying part. Almost none of the infected survived. Normally, without medical treatment, typhoid has a maximum fatality rate of 30%, and the plague, 60%. Yet the reality was much worse. Since these bacteria weren't just some unfortunate outbreak, they were purposely created in Japanese laboratories and deployed as biological weapons. Japanese soldiers spread 50 kilograms of cholera bacteria, 70 kilograms of typhoid bacteria, and bags filled with millions of plague-infected fleas across China. For context, a single bacterium weighs only this tiny amount in grams. Some of these deadly agents were even dispersed from airplanes, with specialized operators on board filming the entire operation. That way, the high-ranking officials funding the experiments could watch the horror unfold. And this was just the beginning. When the Japanese infected the city of Changchun with cholera, they offered their enemies a so-called vaccine. Desperate to save lives, the Chinese authorities accepted the help. However, it was a gruesome trick, since the syringes didn't contain a vaccine, but live, deadly bacteria. And this was just a tiny part of the human experiments conducted under the infamous Unit 731, the very same secret program Naokata Ishibashi worked under. However, the department's grim history began in 1932, when a gifted young microbiologist and military physician, Shiro Ishii, urged Japan's high command to begin research into biological weapons. For 2 years, Ishii had traveled the world, gathering intel on other nations' developments in the field. He came back convinced that Japan was falling dangerously behind. And how do you think the government responded? They handed him funding, a lot of it. Actually, enough to build an entire facility dedicated to producing biological weapons. To minimize the risk to Japanese citizens, they chose the site in Manchuria, a remote, mostly rural region of East Asia that was fully under Japan's control at the time. The military seized land for the facility, violently evicting local residents. What they built was a heavily fortified compound resembling a castle, and those tall walls and watchtowers were to keep people from escaping. Worse still, every Chinese laborer forced to construct the facility was killed once the work was done, to ensure no witnesses remained. The locals quickly nicknamed the place Cursed. Rumors spread of blood-curdling screams echoing from the inside, and people saw prisoners entering, but never leaving. 2 years after the compound was completed, a powerful storm caused a short circuit in the electric fence surrounding it. Several desperate prisoners managed to escape, so, fearing the truth might reach the local population, Ishii gave the order to burn the entire site to the ground. Yet, that wasn't the end. The operation simply relocated to a new base in Pingfang. Only this time, it became the largest biological warfare research center in history. The new compound stretched across 1.5 hectares, designed like a grid of buildings connected by dark corridors. A central hallway split the compound into eastern and western sections. In each stood a 2-story brick special prison capable of holding up to 400 people, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and, most commonly, innocent civilians from Manchuria. Whenever Ishii ran low on prisoners, he ordered his soldiers to raid nearby villages, and they did, abducting men, women, and even children. The only ones they left behind were the elderly, the weak, and the sick, not out of mercy, but because the prisoners had to be healthy. They were needed for experiments. Shiro Ishii officially called Unit 731 a Department for Epidemic Prevention. But in reality, it was the exact opposite. One of its primary goals was developing new strains of lethal bacteria for biological warfare. And to achieve this, the prisoners were deliberately infected with the deadliest diseases on Earth: bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, syphilis, and typhoid fever. Then, Unit 731 scientists studied how each illness affected the human body. In one documented case, soldiers brought a woman to the prison after abducting her along with her newborn child. She knew she wouldn't survive, but pleaded for the baby's life. Instead, they were both subjected to bubonic plague experiments. And if you think things couldn't get any worse, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Once the observation phase was over, the Unit 731 staff, whom I struggle to even call scientists or humans, moved on to practical procedures. Every single prisoner they infected during the more than 10 years of the facility's operation was subjected to vivisection. That is, they performed surgical procedures without anesthesia in the name of research. You may ask, how could someone treat people this way? The thing is, the Unit 731 staff didn't see their victims as people at all. Among themselves, they just called them logs. It was a way to dehumanize these poor people completely and treat them literally like objects, all under the deadly facility's official cover as a lumber mill. However, there were rare flashes of humanity within the walls of Unit 731, like Naokata Ishibashi, a mere technician, who once secretly gave 2 imprisoned women a mirror. And if anyone had found out what he did, he wouldn't have stood a chance. He would have been executed on the spot, since even their own people weren't spared from the unit's brutal discipline. Once, a guard contracted the plague after accidental contact with an infected prisoner. Instead of receiving medical treatment, he was subjected to the same vivisection as the test subjects. And after the scientists managed to create nearly 100% lethal bacterial strains, the Biological Weapons Division stepped in. They were responsible for the mass infections in China that I mentioned earlier. In the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army, under the leadership of Unit 731, delivered nearly 136 kilograms of paratyphoid and anthrax to the city of Xinjiang. They spread it through contaminated food and water sources. The disease began to spread rapidly, but unexpectedly, the Japanese army entered the infected zones themselves. Nearly 10,000 soldiers became infected, and over 1,700 died. The number of civilian casualties was uncountable. And yet, the head of Unit 731, Shiro Ishii, believed he was doing the right thing for his country's security. What's most disturbing is that those in the highest power levels shared the same mindset. And that's why Ishii's projects kept getting more support, more funding, and why the horrors he and his team committed only grew worse. They injected prisoners' veins with seawater and animal blood to see the effects. They mummified victims alive under heat lamps and, conversely, subjected them to extreme cold. One experiment involved freezing prisoners' limbs in ice-cold water and then shattering them. At some point, everyone who ended up in that prison clearly understood their fate. They were not getting out alive. Broken by fear, they submitted, walking to their fate like lambs to the slaughter. There is only one known exception: a prisoner of war captured in Manchuria who resisted and was subjected to extreme cold as a form of torture. He was stripped naked and submerged in freezing water to test how long the human body could resist hypothermia. Nonetheless, realizing he would soon die, he spat at his captors, cursed them, and insulted them until his body could no longer withstand the cold. After that, he shared the same fate as the others. Yet, on rare occasions, prisoners were warmed after cold exposure, but only to determine whether frostbitten limbs could fully recover. There were no limits to the cruelty behind Unit 731's walls. Prisoners were used to test the sharpness of swords and knives, the blast radius of grenades, the penetration power of firearms, and the effectiveness of flamethrowers in combat scenarios. Another gruesome area of research was chemical and gas warfare. Today, we regard those who use such weapons with absolute horror and disgust. But in the 1940s, the elite of Japanese science experimented on humans with mustard gas, sulfur gas, and various nerve agents. Some test subjects lived slightly longer, but only when Unit 731 tested proactive military gear, which proved effective. However, in that hell, there was no mercy. Among the surviving records, it is known that children were experimented on just like adults. When Japanese scientists wanted to test the effects of high pressure on the human body, they once chose an 8 or 10-year-old boy. He was stolen from his parents, who were either executed or tortured in nearby labs. The child was placed in a special chamber where researchers gradually increased the atmospheric pressure. They recorded every stage of his suffering as his lungs compressed to the point of suffocation. And once they had their data, they rapidly reduced the pressure, killing the poor boy instantly. I'd love to end the story here, but I feel compelled to tell you the whole truth about Unit 731, since there was one more horrific thing, perhaps the most revolting of all, and it involved pregnant women. Some women were subjected to cesarean sections without anesthesia just to extract their newborns for experiments. Others were deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases, so researchers could study how the illness progressed, not only in the women, but in the unborn children they carried. And that's it. I won't go into any more details. I don't want to, and I can't. Still, you're probably wondering what happened to the facility and the monsters behind it. As World War II neared its end, Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, putting Unit 731 at risk of exposure, or worse, capture by the Soviets. So the Japanese Ministry of Defense ordered Ishii to destroy everything connected to the project immediately. He then gave the order to execute 600 Chinese employees and to get rid of all remaining prisoners, over 300 people. The unfortunate souls were dragged from their cells and handed pieces of rope. Once they realized what the ropes were for, some used them, choosing to end their suffering on their own terms. Others refused. So the guards brought out bowls of water laced with poison. The rest were killed with lethal injections. After that, Ishii ordered everyone involved in the project to vanish and to take the secret to the grave. And he meant it literally. Each was given a vial of potassium cyanide in case of Soviet capture. All records were destroyed, and only then did the Japanese military blow up the facility. Though parts of it, especially the underground sections, were so solid that they partially survived. Either way, the Japanese weren't planning to surrender. On March 26, 1945, military officials and Shiro Ishii finalized a plan under the poetic name Cherry Blossoms at Night. It was a coordinated attack on civilians in the United States, specifically in San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The plan was to use Imperial Navy submarines to launch seaplanes that would deliver bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, dengue fever, and other deadly pathogens developed by Unit 731. The operation was delayed due to fierce opposition from Japan's Chief of the General Staff, Yoshijiro Umezu, who understood that such an attack could turn the entire planet into a breeding ground for deadly disease. However, Cherry Blossoms at Night resurfaced months later. On September 2nd, when Japan surrendered, some proposed modifying the plan, infecting their own submarine crews with diseases, and sending them on a suicide mission to American shores. But none of that was needed, because then, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders arrived in Japan. Being a microbiologist himself, Sanders was focused on biological weapons and wanted access to Japan's research. He threatened that if the Japanese didn't cooperate, the US would hand them over to the Soviet tribunal. And so he obtained the data from Unit 731. Sanders handed his findings to General Douglas MacArthur, who did something beyond comprehension. He offered the Japanese scientists a deal. If they handed over all the experimental data from Unit 731, they would receive full immunity. And the Japanese agreed. Unit 731's crimes were never mentioned at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and the United States itself made sure of it. So, you know what happened to the scientists who carried out these horrific experiments? Nothing. Many became respected medical professionals, others changed their names, and lived out their lives in peace. Japan itself denied the existence of Unit 731 and its atrocities until 2018, when they finally admitted it, naming 3,607 scientists involved, including 2 princes of the imperial family. Only a few participants in these sadistic experiments dared to speak out. These are elderly people now, begging for forgiveness. Still, they got to live their lives. Their victims never had the chance. I'm sorry, but I honestly have no idea how to end this story. So, if you have something to say, let me know in the comments.